Taipei, Taiwan. Now it's 8:00 p.m. in Taipei, and I'm Ping Li, the president of Alliance for Women's Rights and Sustainable Development. On behalf of the Alliance, I'm very delighted to welcome you all. And at the very beginning, I would like to take this privilege to introduce the host organization, AWRSD, Alliance for Women's Rights and Sustainable Development, which is a non-government organization and also a women's organization. And the goal of the Alliance is to set up an exchanging and a cooperation platform for the women's rights and sustainable development. The platform will enable us to promote relevant research, practice, and advocacy in order to reach gender equality and global sustainable development. Today, I'm very pleased to be the moderator for this session, Women's Empowerment in Disaster Risk Reduction. First of all, I would like to give some words about the theme. Due to the social and the economic structure and the process of socialization, women have been a weak and a vulnerable population group in the society. In other words, the social environment and the long-term socialization process has made women lack of sufficient resources and power to face nature disaster. Empirical studies point out that among nature disasters victims, women have different needs than men. It is an urgent issue to incorporate the needs of different genders into practical work and policy formulation. Today, it's our honor to have 5 experts. Actually, originally we have 4. Right now, we add 1 more. It is our honor to have 5 experts and advocates with us to talk about the title, Women's Empowerment in Disaster Risk Reduction. So first of all, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Michelle Higelin. Are you on the line, Michelle? Hi, Michelle. Michelle Higelin is the Executive Director of Action Aid Australia, where she has led the organization's growth into the Pacific and driving gender transformative programming. So I think this evening we will hear lots of the experience from her about the Pacific, including the use of technology to make the spatial change. She has more than 2.5 decades of experience working to advance women's rights in Australia and internationally, including as the former Deputy General Secretary of one of the largest women's rights movement globally, World YWCA. Michelle has served on global advisory groups to the United Nations Population Fund and the World Food Program, and chaired the NGO Working Group on Peace at the United Nations in Geneva. I have been some years work with Michelle in Geneva as well, and she currently serves on the board of the Australia Council for International Development. And the title of Ms. Higelin, Michelle just told me how to pronounce this French name. Higelin's presentation is Shifting Power and Driving Gender Transformative Approaches. Now the floor is yours, Ms. Michelle Higelin. Yes, please, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Ping, and for that lovely welcome. And also a big thank you to the Alliance for Women's Rights and Sustainable Development for inviting me to join this discussion. Really looking forward to what's also tonight for me. It's a little bit later than Taiwan, but really good to join with others to discuss this topic. And I think also to bring some of ActionAid's experience from particularly the Pacific region, but also some of our work in Asia. For those of you who don't know ActionAid, we are a global women's rights organisation working in over 45 countries to end poverty and injustice. And shifting power, as Ping alluded to in the opening, as well as supporting women's leadership during times of crisis, are core elements of ActionAid's feminist humanitarian approach around the world. And in the last 3 years, particularly through the support of ActionAid Australia, we've been able to support 30,000 women across the Asia Pacific region to prepare for and respond to disaster risk. And this work does include working with a coalition in the Pacific, the Shifting the Power Coalition, which brings together 13 women-led organisations to promote diverse Pacific women's leadership in response to climate change and disasters. The coalition was established in 2016, and effectively we're working across the areas of advocacy at the regional and national level, training and providing rapid response funding to our partners, as well as building evidence around the impact of disasters on women, and driving Pacific women-led innovations and making sure they're resourced. And so I'll be sharing some reflections from this work, particularly in the Pacific, through my presentation. The first thing I wanted to start with was to really say that, I think we all would agree we need urgent action. The number of disasters resulting from natural hazards has doubled in the past 25 years. And definitely due to climate change, we are seeing disasters increase in intensity, frequency and impact, and most profoundly in the Pacific region, where most of the countries at the top of the World Disaster Risk Index are actually in our region. And 93% of deaths from disasters are occurring in low-income countries, with women and children 14 times more likely to die than men, which really urgently points to some of the very real realities of the gendered impacts of crisis. And I think, as we sit amidst still the world's largest global emergency with COVID-19, which is estimated to have set gender equality back by a decade, we know it's critical that we look at how can we address this intersection of gender and disaster risk. So I guess that's where I wanted to follow on to say that, we know now that gender equality is a key driver of disaster risk. In 2016, ActionAid worked with the Economist Intelligence Unit to develop the South Asia Women's Resilience Index, and this looked across 7 countries in the South Asia region around the various factors that were either contributing to or hampering women's resilience in times of crisis. And what this index found is that there is this vicious cycle of vulnerability and disempowerment that continues to hamper women's capacity to build resilience to disasters. So, for example, we see that women continue to be excluded from planning at different levels around disaster management and disaster response. And so as a result, when a crisis hits, their needs and priorities are ignored and frequently under-prioritised and under-resourced. And so therefore we do see that gender inequality deepens in a time of crisis. And so, of course, women's empowerment is critical in this situation. As I said, when women are disproportionately impacted by disasters, and two of the things we often see are that rates of violence against women increase, women's unpaid work also increases. And in fact, recent ActionAid research found that during the first period of lockdown during COVID-19, which we do see as an emergency, as a disaster of a different nature, it has set back progress to, what we saw through the research we did over those first 2 months of lockdown was that violence did increase in every region of the world, violence against women. And we also saw an increase in women's unpaid care work, particularly as schools shut down and children were also forced to stay at home, leaving women to, predominantly look after children. So, but the other thing we do see through all of our work around the world is that women are the first to step up when a crisis hits. However, the reality is this leadership frequently goes unrecognised. Yet our experience shows that when women are effectively resourced to lead efforts to prepare for and respond to crisis or disasters, more lives are saved, women and girls are better protected from violence, and communities are better prepared for crisis and become more resilient. From ActionAid's perspective, we do see disasters as a catalyst for longer term gains in gender equality. If we can invest in women's leadership prior to a disaster, then women's visible leadership in a time of crisis will open opportunities for women to take broader leadership roles across society. So I just wanted to really, bring to life this work through an example from our work in Vanuatu. ActionAid Vanuatu began in 2015 in the aftermath of Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, and that was a Category 5 cyclone, the worst category of cyclones, and left a devastating impact on women, particularly in rural and coastal areas. For those of you who don't know the context in Vanuatu, there are no women in the National Parliament. It has some of the highest rates of violence against women globally and a heightened risk of disasters. And in fact, it's #1 on the World Disaster Risk Index in terms of the country most likely to experience the risk of disasters. So efforts to really focus on women's empowerment in a context of reducing disaster risk are essential. So through our work, we've established the Women Talk Together network, Women Talk Together. This brings together over 5,000 women across 5 islands in Vanuatu to build women's leadership in response to climate change and disasters. And it aims to support women's voice in disaster planning. And so very practically what that means is, supporting women to assess disaster risk, to look at issues like protection threats, to think about their own existing capacities, their existing resources in the community in terms of how they can respond, to develop preparedness plans, including things like how to evacuate the most vulnerable in communities, and definitely to strengthen their response capacity so that when a crisis hits, women can lead relief efforts and efforts to protect their rights. And, I guess as something of a baseline in terms of this work, 5 years ago, when we first started, women's leadership was, largely ignored when women tried to alert their communities to Cyclone Pam that was coming. Yet today, now they are leading early warning communications efforts, reaching 40% of the population. And that's through the Women Wet and Wetter system. It's a Pacific women-led innovation. We followed a model that came out of one of our partners in the Shifting the Power Coalition, FemLink Pacific, who set up Women's Weather Watch. This was adapted to the Vanuatu context. And now we're also adapting it again in Papua New Guinea in response to the COVID crisis that's currently being experienced there. And if you'd like to know more about these women-led early warning systems, we have just published today this report with UNDRR, which is looking at and documents some of the learnings from these Pacific women-led early warning systems. I think my time's coming close, so I'll just say that there's some really important things there about how do we ground these things in existing community connections and networks. How do we make sure messages reach the most the most vulnerable in a most accessible way, and to recognise the benefit by supporting women's leadership in broader gender transformative change. And I just want to say that what I think is critical as we move forward in this area is that we do need to find a way to have a common framework. ActionAid has developed with Monash University this gender transformative framework for responding to climate change and disasters. And this really emphasises the importance of us investing in women's leadership at every level of decision making, recognising the localised and Indigenous knowledge that women bring to the table alongside scientific evidence, resourcing women's organisations and networks as the key actors to be able to prevent and respond to the gendered impacts of disasters. And most importantly, that we can't respond to the gendered risk of disasters without tackling harmful gender norms that continue to expose women to increased risk. I had some final reflections, but I think, Ping, my time is probably up. Is that right?
It's okay. It's okay.
It's okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So
Lovely.
I would just say, okay, well, I would just say, I think that we do need to take a comprehensive approach to women's empowerment. Too often we see people looking at gender equality a different way in terms of climate change adaptation, something different in terms of disaster risk reduction, and then something different in humanitarian response. Being more coherent in our approach will see us have greater impact. I think also making sure that we are taking a truly intersectional feminist approach, and this means creating space and leadership for the agency of diverse women. And I think finding ways that we can transform the humanitarian system to move beyond this idea of women as passive recipients of aid, to actually see the tremendous capability and capacity that women from affected communities have, and in fact are best placed to respond in times of crisis. And definitely through our work, we've seen how important things like an investment in technology and resources can be in terms of accelerating change. But thank you very much, and appreciate the opportunity to share these reflections.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you very much. And Michelle's presentation shared ActionAid's gender transformative framework for responding to climate change and the disasters and the COVID-19 and the cyclone, which aims to break down silos across the development, humanitarian, and security nexus, and use increasing disasters as a catalyst for gender equality. It also highlights lessons learned from ActionAid work with Shifting the Power Coalition in the Pacific to support diverse Pacific women's leadership in responding to the preparing for disasters. I think it's a wonderful, very good experience to share with us. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. And the next we move to the Dr. Washal Silen. Washal. Hello, Washal.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes,
Hi.
We're here.
Good. Washal is an excellent Indigenous Taya woman. Taya is one of the 16 officially recognized Indigenous peoples in Taiwan. Dr. Silen works as a researcher at the Center for Research on Ethnic Relations and Nationalism, University of Helsinki, Finland. And Washal is an indigenous name. Washal just told me how to pronounce it. Washal is a young Taya woman. She has never encountered any natural disasters in her life. Today, she invites a senior Taya woman, Yapit Tali, is right yes. Pronunciation? Yapit Tali, who has rich experience in dealing with nature disasters. women's ability to face and deal with disastrous experience is very, very precious and must be listened to carefully. I think it's valuable for us. This kind of wisdom handed down orally by women to women and from generation to generation is the most valuable asset of mankind. This session, this senior Thaya woman, Yapit Tali, actually we arranged it just yesterday. She is from Hsinchu, Taiwan. She will speak in Thaya language, then Washao will help us translate it into English. This is truly a model of intergeneration learning for women, and we have the privilege to learn together. The following will be handed over to Washao. Washao, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So now I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Yes, so I will make it bigger. Okay, right. Yes, so it's all okay? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for inviting us to this important forum. And we are, so first of all, Loka Simukwara, greetings to you all. We are two Taiwan women living in the indigenous communities in Taiwan, and now I'm based in Helsinki in Finland. So it's truly a great privilege to be here. And today we're going to share on the topic of being an indigenous woman in the context of multiple crises. And we have discussed, and then now we have come up with 3 lessons that we can come up from the indigenous perspective. And as you see in the background of this first presentation, it is a traditional Taiwan weaving from my community. And the traditional Taiwan weaving is very important for all the women to learn. And it has relevance to our history, to our wisdom and resilience, and most importantly, to the land. So today, we invited all of you to think about women's empowerment in environmental and disaster risk and reduction from a more holistic perspective, that we can open up ourselves and then kind of thinking outside the box from the indigenous woman's point of view. So I will go next.
Washa, could you speak a little bit slow, because we have lots of women from Taiwan. They don't speak English, but they really want to learn some experience from here. And they just said, your weaving is so beautiful. So may I ask you to speak a little bit slow? Yes, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I tend to speak very fast when I'm nervous, and it's such an exciting and nerve-wracking experience to speak in front of so many of you. I will slow down. So first things first, indigenous peoples in Taiwan are part of Austronesians. 台湾的原住民族是南岛语族的一部分. So as you can see that in this map, Taiwan is over there, and we are part of a greater indigenous Austronesian speaking family that is connected across the sea. So we see ourselves as custodians of the land and the sea. And so we face unique climate and environmental challenges as indigenous women. So maybe some of you are not so familiar with Taiwan. I will go through a small introduction of Taiwan. So Taiwan is often categorized as part of East Asia. Although for indigenous peoples, we are more connected through ocean, but Taiwan is more kind of often think about as continental, has more continental base. And Taiwan is an island of similar size of the Netherlands or Belgium. We have a lot of people, 23.5 million, and indigenous peoples are only 2%, around 2%, so 500,000. So we are not the majority, but we are fighting for our rights nonetheless. And we have many groups in Taiwan, as Ping previously explained. We have many more groups, but only 16 groups being recognized by the state. And you can see on the right-hand side, we're all very different. And today we're going to talk about Indigenous women's wisdom from the Diane, which is in the circle. And we all have our oral history, so not written history. And our Romanization system is learned from the Western missionaries and churches. So we are mostly an oral history nation, and around 30% of us live in the metropolitan area. So we are not only from the mountains, but also a lot of us are now having quite modern lives while thinking how to link back to our community where the knowledge is mostly there. So today we're going to talk about not one crisis, not one environmental disaster, but multiple crises as experienced by the Indigenous woman. So as you can see here, the climate environment crisis is only part of the many crises that we as Indigenous women face. In the Indigenous societies, there is challenges of language loss, of identity shift, of spirituality differences, and our culture is not the same as before. And also our land is grabbed away from us. All these determine we Indigenous women, our dignity, our development, and health. Everything is interconnected. So it's impossible to think about environmental crisis as it is, but we need to think about it from the holistic perspective. And on top of that, we also need to remember the colonial history that has an impact on the Indigenous peoples. Many of you would remember that during the Japanese colonization, we, the Diane people, has been forcefully removed from traditional territory. We had our wisdom to how to cope with the environmental changes and all the different kinds of natural transformation. But because we are removed from our land, and nowadays we really struggle to how to really implement the land-based knowledge with the land that we have right now. So on the left-hand side, you can see it is taken from 1912 when the Japanese relocated our community. And now the picture taken just 1-2 years ago, it's relatively the same place, but you can see the modern road straight into the community, and it has dramatically changed the way of life that we have before. So for those of you who are not familiar, this is a small history of colonial rule in Taiwan. This is not past, but also indicate the ongoing condition that impact the legal and political framework on multiple systems. So environmental risk reduction system, on the welfare system, on how our identity being recognized system. So all these different systems are impacted by this ongoing colonial rule. Right. So next. So when I started to talk about environmental challenges and disasters, there is a prevalent kind of fear that the elders have been telling me. So the elder will say to me, the quotation from before, from below, that she would say that some years ago, I remember there was a big typhoon that hit the community. Water rushed down from the mountain slope and caused floods. So she was referring to this slope that you can see from here, that water is falling down, straight down, and she was really afraid because she couldn't move anywhere and she didn't know where to move. And she continued to say that my whole house was flooded. I got out of the bed and the water level was all the way up to almost on the knee, and the cracks appear on all the cement walls. Children were too scared to sleep at our home. So this is a very important experience and testimony of crisis threaten the rights of Indigenous women in Taiwan. And this is another picture taken by me. And this is my dear grandmother. And she was really concerned and afraid our home that was destroyed by the floods and the mudslides caused by the typhoon. And she has tried to apply this land to be hers or our families, but we get stuck in the political bureaucracy and the systems. And she has knowledge and practice to live on this land, but she's not included in the decision-making system. So it's very little that she can do. And from this picture, you can see what she saw from that car. So this picture was, it used to be our home, but not anymore. We're all very lucky to be still alive. And so the lesson one that I would like to share with you before handing the microphone to Yapit is that the first lesson is that we really need to rebuild the interconnecting system and the relationship within our community. So jisan or minjisan, which is the past tense, is that we really need to reconnect with each other and strengthening the relationship through gather together, which is sili that my grandmother taught me. So jisan or bajisan or minjisan, so different forms of this Dayan word. Jisan is a form of storytelling that was passed down generation from generation, but it was not really recognizing any of the official mainstream system. But this is nevertheless plays such an important role for the Indigenous elderly women because it reduced physical and emotional burden resulting from typhoons, mudslides, and other natural disasters that we experience almost on the monthly or seasonal basis. So this is the number one lesson. And now we have the lesson 2 and 3, and I will invite Yapit to explain in Dayan language, and I will try my best to explain in the English. So Yapit, are you online? 你在线上吗？
有，大家好，有听到声音吗？Hello，
有
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. Yang sami kani makiberagya kanahan kaniga kahon malahang maki juwan na puking te kutuga kayan te sayinga hayen te juwanga tayen.
For us Indigenous women, it is a very important and root to our core that there are 3 important elements that to us as the basis of the system for caring, which is Kayan, which is the sky, the heavens, Tayan, which is us, and the Rahayat, which is the land.
Oh, kehu.
Ow. Hi.
Nanu kehula,下一张。
Yahula.
Yeah, 下
Ow.
对，下一张。哦。Tesaying sami kenering tayen ga kahunta bererau musa muya kuara anananu vahat melahang kenehan tayen kani yang kedeketan pesyasing kani.
So from this picture, we can really see how these 3 elements play a part that is taken together into we as Indigenous women's everyday action, which we call as bererau. So how these 3 different elements through our action will make the idea of custodian become lived, become alive.
Nanu yasa kani kehu kani. Kehu kani. Nanu te jugan pesyasing kani ga musa yang nanu kahun bererau kani ga Musa matevak laki Toye makiano yang ter 有吗？
哎，刚刚好像有点断线。
对，好，我再讲一次。Yang tejuang kaniga nanu kahun pererau kaniga Musa matevak laki tayen Toye makiano ru yang terakis Musa kemeloh kenahan naha.
So because we have practiced this bararau, which we practice as an indigenous woman into the community. So if we really make this caring system happen, it will be like the rakis, which is millet that you see in this picture, that we will be really pass on from one person to another.
Ya salah, isulah.
Okay. So we also try to really make the point that it is a very important to kind of passing on the knowledge, because that is how we live and survive as Taiwan people. And thank you, Yavis, for your knowledge and wisdom. And sorry for this disorganized manner. So if there's anything that you want to ask, it can happen afterwards. So just to wrap up with 2 last slides. So we really want to make sure that the gender equality from our point of view is important. And so the first thing that is important is that we don't see things as separate. So nature and our culture, they are all interlinked. We don't see caring as mechanical, medical caring, but also like all the things connect together. Sorry, I will slow down. And the second point is that a system that excludes connections to nature, land, and spirituality can be damaging. And this is explained very perfectly with Yapit's understanding of how the 3 core elements, the heaven, the sky, the people, and their land, they're all interlinked in order to really rethink about what crisis mean and how do we deal with this kind of crisis. And the third that we want to emphasize is that we need to have a cultural sustainability, a kind of equality, healthy identities, and social trust. They are a prerequisite for a sustainable future. And the last slide is that we want to re-emphasize that we need multiple worldviews and language in decision-making pertaining to sustainability and the climate governance. And the multiple worldviews and languages include Dayan worldview and Dayan language. And we want to say that gender responsive governance that we are emphasizing today should include Indigenous women's voices, which include the 3 lessons that we brought to you today. So Jisan, Malahang, and Barrao. Thank you very much for your time. And if there's any questions or wondering out loud, we are very happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for Yapit and Washal. Washal, thank you for your introduction for us about the Tayas tribe, Indigenous tribe, and let us know about your tribe Taya. And it's also very beautiful presentation from Yapit. It's really the Indigenous women's experience and wisdom, and we hope we still have the occasion to ask Yapit to share with us in the other occasions. And people already ask you some question, but we will offer this raise these questions after the panelist presentation. Okay, and then next we move to Dr. Kai Wen Luo. Dr. Luo,
hello.
Are you there? Hi, Dr. Kai Wen Luo is the Chief of Emergency and Rescue Corps Fire Department We are very honored to have this occasion this opportunity to invite Dr. Luo to join us. And Dr. Kai-Wen Luo has a 24 years functional experience in fire department of New Taipei City government. He served at the Emergency Dispatch Center for 10 years. The battalion chief, actually, this is my first time to learn this word. Battalion chief for years and the ICT chief for 5 years. His professional fields are incident command system, organizational management, ICT, product development, and agile methodologies. Welcome you, Dr. Luo. Now the floor is yours, please.
Okay, wait for a moment.
And the title of Dr. Luo's presentation is New Taipei City Women's Empowerment in Disaster Risk Reduction. Now you can start. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, moderator, Ms. Pin. And hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. It's my honor and the pleasure to present this report with the topic of New Taipei City Women's Empowerment in Disaster Risks Reduction. Here is the outline. We have 2 issues about disaster risks and the challenges of migrant workers and the new immigrants living in New Taipei City. And then we have 5 initiatives to deal with these 2 issues. And then finally is the conclusion. Let's dive in the first issue, disaster risks. Please look at the right bar chart on this slide. We see that there are 7 categories of disasters frequently impacting Taiwan. If we take area of country affected into consideration, the top 3 disasters in Taiwan are earthquake, tropical storm. Wait a moment, and flooding. Please look at the left colorful chart that focus on the north part of Taiwan. That's the location of our city, New Taipei City. The area in orange means that New Taipei City has above average risks in earthquake threat, while the C part in darker blue shows that our city has also above average risk in tropical storm impact. However, threat from natural disasters is not always simple enough. Let us run in the territory of New Taipei City to see the detail of disasters. As you see, apparently, there are 2 nuclear plants in the north of New Taipei City. It is why our mayor, Mr. Ho, always announced the nuclear safety is the highest priority in our city. And have you seen the brown line on the left side of this chart? It is the location of an active fault. We call it 三角断层 or 三角 active fault. It's crossed from the west to the north, passing through the populous area between Taipei City and the New Taipei City. And you may see a lot of yellow spots on the chart, right? They are communities located along the slope of hills with potential risk in landslide, while lines in red, orange, and green are the locations of potential debris flow torrents. Let me put it this way. Our city, New Taipei City, really faces many challenges of natural disasters. Let me give you a well-known example with the most severe damages in New Taipei City currently. Please look at this photo. That is the this is from Typhoon Sudira in 2015. When this typhoon approached the territory of our city, just within couples hours, its intensive rainfall caused a major landslide, like the photo, to destroy the only road out of the district Wulai and trapped more than 5,000 people inside. It's called the islanding effects. The consequence spent the local government 1 week repairing the only road and finally recovered the daily life for all of the residents in Wulai. Besides natural disasters, man-made hazards are also threats from citizens living in New Taipei City. For instance, fire accidents. This chart shows that there are more accidents per year, and the peak is near 2,800 in 2018. That means that there is an average of 5 to 7 fire accidents every day happening in our city. They caused not only the loss of property, but the casualty of people. This chart is the statistics of fire deaths by gender in 2017 to 2021. The percentage of male death in a fire is 70%, more than 30% of female deaths. So you will know that men were 2 points happened. So women can help. Okay, we just talk about the first issue, and then the second issue is women who came from other countries. This chart shows that there are totally 700,000 migrant workers. Apparently, the trend of the number of migrant workers goes up increasingly. Do you know which industries female migrant workers work for? The answer is social welfare migrant workers. In New Taipei City, more than 99% migrant workers in social welfare are female. Moreover, 38% of them came from Indonesia, 31% from Vietnam, and 22% from the Philippines, and the 9% from Thailand, which are unable to speak Chinese, Mandarin, and Taiwanese. Another group is new immigrants. This chart shows that New Taipei City is the largest, the city with the accounting for nearly 20%. It's a little bit different from migrant workers. More than 60% came from mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau, who can speak Chinese. And then 90% from Vietnam, 5% from Indonesia, and the rest from the Philippines and the Thai. Those immigrants are mainly female, and they speak Vietnamese, Indonesian, and English and time. So there are two challenges for those migrant workers and new immigrants living in our city. The first one is language barriers, which are likely to impede the formation of interpersonal relationship with the local resilience, and let's lead to conflict, frustration, and offense. The other one is cultural shocks, which include the information overload, technology gap, skill interdependence, etc. So those two challenges dramatically affected their access to information of disaster reduction. Therefore, most of them are lack of knowledge and the cost then to have incorrect ideas and the behaviors to deal with the relevant risks. For example, because they were lack of knowledge, they some of them don't know that they will get carbon monoxide poisoning when they used a gas heater in the poor ventilation environments, while others didn't know how to respond when disasters strike. For example, earthquake. Most of them think to evacuate immediately from the building they stayed, but the correct behavior is to stay inside, to drop, cover, and hold on. You must protect yourself at the first time. So others didn't know how to do preparedness planning and disaster relief, and the others don't know how to get available assistance and benefits from the government. So we came up with 5 initiatives. The first one is we published a handbook called Home Safety in Disaster Prevention, a manual from a women perspective. It has 5 languages like Mandarin, English, Indonesian, Vietnamese, and Thai. It's also provided 2 types like physical handbooks and the virtual ebooks. You can download the ebooks from this QR code. These multi-language and the multi-typed handbooks provide very important information of how to respond to a variety of disasters around us living in New Taipei City. Next, we will talk about how to leverage volunteer groups. The initiative number 2 is to organize the units of female volunteers of fire prevention promotion. Until now, there are 34 units in New Taipei City and more than 100 females. What do? They did a lot of things. They have more than 500 campaigns of fire prevention every year, while they assist to install more than 10,000 fire alarms in households per year. These performers popularized the knowledge of disaster prevention, as well as enhanced the penetrate rate of fire early warning in household. Okay, the initiative number 3, try to think if there are always a well-trained person who know how to respond before, during, and after disasters strike. in every public and private sectors. Is this very helpful for our safety? The answer is absolutely yes. This is why we government set up the certificate of disaster relief volunteers. In New Taipei City, there are more than 2,000 disaster relief volunteers. 38 are female, and we also train 100 and more female volunteers every year. The fourth initiative is to develop resident communities in New Taipei City. Our government encouraged all of communities in New Taipei City to apply for this program. After 3 to 6 months workshops and the training courses, capable resilient community will have its own team with team member who came from residents in their own community. The team also is responsible for routine preparedness as well as responding together when a disaster impacts. That's very helpful for disaster relief according to research. However, we found a problem. Aging. More than 50% of participants in resident communities are 60 and more years old, especially for ones in rural areas in our city. The low mobility of the old participants may have negative effects on disaster response and even make them self in danger. So, how do we do to overcome this upcoming aging trend? Maybe the answer is on the side of the youth. Last year, the local government had a new attempt to establish a disaster prevention youth volunteer team. The range of the team members' age is 15 to 20 years old. We trained 70 young team members, including 43 female youth. We really find out their energy and creativity. They engage in some activities like physical promotion and the events designs. They also assist our video shots and the achievement exhibition. We also find out their unlimited potential in the future. So conclusion, we still to promote young people to join our disaster prevention youth volunteer team, while we try to expand the scale of female volunteers of fire prevention promotion and the disaster relief. We also do our best to invite female migrant workers and the new immigrants to be our group of volunteers and cooperate with relative groups of them. Finally, we encourage women to serve as leaders in groups of relevant disaster preparedness. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Luo. It's really a good idea about the women can help, and the women in New Taipei City can actually act a community disaster prevention advocates and also the leaders on the disaster prevention issues. And I am also very impressed that Dr. Luo mentioned the disaster occurred, when the disaster occurred, how to help the disadvantaged people like the marital immigrants and the migrants workers from the other countries to Taiwan. This is also very important part during the disaster, particularly these marital immigrants and and the foreign workers in Taiwan. Majority of them are female, they are women. And thank you so much, Dr. Luo. And then we will move to the last speaker, Dr. Leslie Ann Foster. Before I introduce my very good friend, Dr. Leslie Ann Foster, and I would like to mention the audience and the participants, if you have any questions, please write down in the chat. Then we will collect your questions to ask our presenters later. Okay, now I would like to introduce Dr. Leslie Ann Foster. Leslie Ann Foster, she is executive director at the Ghanaian Women's Support Center. I think it's in South Africa. Dr. Foster was the president of a humanitarian sexual rights network. She was also on the board of IWRAWAP, and their work was across 122 countries. It's a very important women's organization of the world. She works on issues of gender equality and social justice, with a specific focus on violence against women, HIV/AIDS, and sexual reproductive rights. Dr. Foster is a feminist. Her personal vision is to work towards a world where all women are free and enjoy all their human rights. Now, the floor is yours, Dr. Foster.
Thank you so much. Is my presentation visible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the speakers and to you, Ping, for having me on this panel. It is great to be able to make this presentation today. And I really I've learned a lot so far. So just moving on, just a moment. Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Masimanyane Women's Rights International. We are an equality and justice organization working to end gender-based violence and femicide. What's important to know is that we also host the International Network to End Violence Against Women and Girls. We work in 15 African countries and across 3 continents. And the main focus of our work is to repoliticize gender-based violence. I want to sketch some of the context in which we are working. I want to be very clear that we're working with organizations from the South, in South Africa, and across many other African countries. Our main issue is about addressing inequality in our societies. Now, what we've come to experience is that inequality between men and women is exacerbated by climate change and environmental disasters, which then widens and deepens the inequality in our society. In South Africa, we have many female-headed households and across many of the African countries. And what we've seen from research is that female-headed households are more vulnerable and at greater risk in the context of environmental disasters and climate change. Gender-based violence is a key risk in all situations where these environmental disasters occur. We have noted through our work that women experience inequality through various forms of marginalization. Political marginalization in our society, social, economically, culturally, institutionally, and with COVID, digital marginalization became a very critical issue. When we speak about political exclusion, what we mean is that there are very few women in decision-making positions in parliaments, local government structures, and state institutions. Women are barred from taking part in elections due to family commitments, the decision made by a spouse or a family elder as to whether they can engage or not. Positions of leadership are assigned to men by virtue of their standing in society. This leads to political exclusion, but it has very clear interlinkages with the social and economic aspects. So when we talk about
Excuse me.
social,
Excuse
Yes.
me, Leslie, would you
Yes.
want us to put the your PowerPoint, or you will make it by yourself?
I thought I'm
think-
doing it. Sorry, my apologies. Is it clear now? Do you see it?
No.
Not yet.
Okay, good.
You
Good.
got it.
Now we can see that.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure. Perhaps I didn't, press on share. So when we talk about social exclusion, women make up the majority in most social institutions in our countries, in churches, other religious institutions, school bodies, but also in their own lives. But they have the least say in these spaces. Women have, and as previous speaker said this, have heavy care burdens and are unable to participate in social gatherings or events, again, based on their low status within society, and cultural and traditional systems which place women in these positions require them to have men speak or act on their behalf. So women lack the resources, financially, otherwise, to engage socially. There are always increased risks of violence when women and girls are displaced and in temporary shelters, and girls are kept attending to school to help with care burdens. These are part of the social exclusions. I want to speak about sexual and reproductive health and rights because often this is excluded from any conversation about disaster management. So in the context of disasters, women and girls' access to sexual and reproductive health and rights affect menstruation and pregnancy-related issues. Menstrual poverty in our context in the South, where women don't have access to sanitary protection and so forth, keeps girls from going to school. But what I've also learned from women here is that drought, which is a very big issue in our areas, leads to a lack of water and therefore poor menstrual hygiene, which in turn leads to diseases of the reproductive system and adds to the disease burden which women and girls carry. So the health of pregnant women are compromised by floods and drought and typhoons across many of the African countries that we speak to. So there's a very specific way in which women, through their sexual and reproductive health and rights, are impacted by disasters, and offered in disaster management programs, this is not even considered. So in South Africa, we have actually many different disasters, but particularly in the area where I live, drought is one of the problems. And 3 weeks ago, we had enormous floods that completely destroyed homes. So these problems, with drought, they kill crops, they reduce food security. Loss of livestock means less ability to earn income from the sale of milk and meat. And with floods, women have their homes destroyed. As I mentioned earlier, 35% of households in South Africa are female-headed. So this is a really serious problem. And typhoons and hurricanes are gaining momentum in our country. And all of these have knock-off impacts from shelter right down to food security for women who are responsible for their families. The gender-specific losses, again, I've just mentioned this, loss of homes, loss of formal employment. Sometimes women lose their work because they cannot access the work that they are doing, or the farms they're working on are destroyed. They cannot access credit because of low literacy levels, and also the inability to travel to centers where they can access that. They don't have insurance. They haven't got access to their social networks. And this is very difficult in the times of disaster. The damage of crops, I've said, leads to reduced income because a lot of women grow food in order to sell it for income, but also to provide for their families. And then the care burdens that we've spoken about, having to care for the elderly, for children in the face of disaster becomes a bigger problem. And recovery for women from environmental disasters in our context is much more challenging due to the lack of access that they experience. What we often do not consider is the risk of gender-based violence in the face of disasters. All disasters that we have known about put women and girls at greater risk. The risk of violence in under-resourced rural areas and remote areas is higher because of the lack of access to support. Cultural and traditional practices intensify. So we see child marriage and forced marriage being increasing in our context, simply because families do not have enough food to feed everybody, so they want to marry the girl children off so that the burden passes to another family. Sometimes they believe that the girl will be protected if she's married to somebody, rather than being on the streets and homeless without shelter. So we always hear about rapes and abductions of girls from temporary shelters, and these have a lasting impact on their lives and the well-being of all survivors. So we've also, of course, during COVID, I think the previous speaker spoke about this, seen an intensification of COVID together with climate change and environmental disasters, impacting very heavily on women and girl children. Something we don't speak about often enough in disasters is the necessity to take a human rights approach when dealing with disasters, and looking at what are the structural and systemic barriers that are created which reduce development opportunities towards securing equality. Women and girls in reconstruction programs are paid lip service. So we hear people talking about, oh, we must include women and girls, but in actual fact, it's a very superficial engagement which doesn't really draw on the courage, the knowledge, the resilience of women and girl children. And there is very seldom, as I said, a focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And this makes it life very difficult in all humanitarian situations. As part of the recommendations that we think should be considered, rebuilding efforts and just transitions. For just transitions to really be effective, women and girls must be at the center of those conversations. They must be able to make meaningful, strategic contributions to the rebuilding efforts. They must be in all of the decision-making spaces, not just one or two of them, and not just token women, which many disaster management programs tend to do, because they bring a different experience and a different knowledge to those conversations, and they can richly enhance those conversations. They must, where it is difficult for them to speak, be given the opportunity to make contributions. So if we're looking at cultural and traditional settings in our country, in many of them, women are not allowed to speak at all. Only men can voice their opinions. And if women are not allowed to speak, and if we do not make the efforts to bring their voices into the conversation, then those efforts to properly address humanitarian disasters becomes fruitless. Women need to be visible. They must have voice. They must be in the decision-making power in all development initiatives, before as planning for disasters as well as responding to them. And the barriers that contribute to inequality must be acknowledged, understood, and measures put in place to avoid deepening the fissures. The specific needs with regards to protection from all forms of violence must carefully be considered and included in reconstruction plans. So very seldom is this aspect considered. And when there are rapes reported or there are abductions reported, then the responses are inadequate. So if we think about it beforehand, the responses can be far more impactful. The care burdens that women have due to disasters must be shared by all genders. This is still a big problem. Of course, it's a global issue where all of the care work is placed on the shoulders of women, and that affects their physical health, their mental well-being, and so forth. In essence, what we need is a comprehensive risk reduction framework, which is developed to ensure efforts and policies to address the climate and environmental crisis. It must have a rights-based approach that is conducive to the achievement of women's rights and the elimination of all forms of gender-based violence against women and girls. I'm encouraged to say that across the African continent, there are many young climate justice advocates in very many countries that are really fighting to respond to climate change, and also looking at climate and environmental justice initiatives, having their voices and their activism heard very strongly in that. So I think that in closing, what we have to remember is that we do need an intersectional, multi-sectoral, sectoral approach to addressing disasters. It cannot be a male-dominated area of response. We have the responsibility to work together, and building the leadership of young women is critical. And I was very happy to hear that from one or two of the presentations, because that's an approach we are using across Africa as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for Dr. Foster. And now is the time for the Q&A. And I think some people ask very good questions. Let's see the chat. I think first very good question is from I think one is from Michelle Hagley. Michelle, would you want to ask for us and by yourself as well, and to ask the Yapit and the Washal
Yes,
for
sure,
their
that's fine,
presentation? Yeah, good.
Yeah, look, I think I was really interested in what you were saying about particularly the sort of Indigenous oral traditions and what we can learn from that in terms of looking at this whole area. And I think that really resonated with me around some of what also Pacific women are saying around, their Indigenous knowledge and how it can contribute. And I guess my question is around, we know it's so important, but how do we lift that knowledge? How do we recognize it? How do we make sure it informs better, disaster risk planning? In this world that's so obsessed about having everything written down, having everything, sort of formalized in some way. And I guess I wonder how we tackle that challenge, but it definitely feels like something we need to be doing. Thank you.
And Washal?
Thank you so much, Michelle, for the important question. I have been discussing with Yapit about this very important. I think for us, it is really about a system change, because there are many things and good ideas that we discussed throughout the presentation that we agree with everything, but then things just don't change. Our voice is not heard, and the decision-making kind of exclude, like you said, privilege, the written system or the policy making that is from a very narrow, maybe like practical reduction way of decision making rather than from this alternative way of decision making. So we are actually also wondering about the same, that it has been core of our advocacy of how do we really make our voices heard, but the progress is very limited. And then we are also thinking about, for example, in the disaster relief presentation, that Indigenous people were also part of this operation, and we kind of also know a lot about how is land, how do you interact with the land, and where can you go, where can you not go, how do you see the traces. But it feels like the Indigenous people are kind of recruited as a person that you carry out the very end of the chain task, rather than being able to join the decision-making table. So, so yeah, it's I don't know if there's similar experiences from Australia, but at least in Taiwan, it is it's a multiple crisis, or this paradigm that is not changed. So it's very difficult to really have a say in this. But I'm curious to listen to if you have any thoughts or experience of how do we really make this imbalanced not happen anymore.
Thank you so much for Washa, your sharing, and we are also enjoyed very much about Yapi's presentation. Even her language we don't know, but through your translation, we are really impressed that the women's work together and the oral training for the different generation. And I have one question for Dr. Luo, and I think your department had done lots of very incredible work for the people, and for the first line rescue, and you mentioned also the volunteers in your department, and for the first line rescue and the volunteers, do you have the training or courses or classes for the like the gender equality or women's leadership or women's issues in your department? Because I think the people, they needed this sense how to help the women.
Okay, about the training above women's rights. In Taiwan's government, the employees in public sectors needed to accept 30 to 40 hours per year in a lot of field. One of the fields is including the sexual quality, right? Sexual quality, yes. However, about the volunteers groups, there are no there are no rules to enforce them to accept such training courses. But we will take this suggestion into consideration. As you know, we have already realized that volunteers group is very variable for women's rights and disaster reduction, right? I also say women can help. So we could try to train and to promote such knowledge to such a group, to let this knowledge and the information to every volunteers groups. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And all the participants, you also can share your reflection on our chat about these issues. And I would like to move the questions to Dr. Leslie Foster. You had been served as the board member for IWRAW, and which is working on CEDAW very much. Yes. And you have been in Taiwan to share your experience on behalf of the IWRAW. That's how we met together.
Yes. Yeah. That's right.
And,
yes.
Yes, and you are a CEDAW expert. You are really. And
well, I work on CEDAW, yes.
Right. Could you offer your view from the CEDAW to explain the women and the natural disaster risk reduction, the meaning on that?
Yes.
And
well, yes, CEDAW offers us the most comprehensive analysis around discrimination and oppression of women. And that's what it's all about, is looking at what does substantive equality mean, what does non-discrimination mean, and so forth. And of course, what does de facto equality mean? So the CEDAW committee has taken on the climate change agenda, into, of course, when it was first started, that wasn't an issue, or it has, an article on rural women, and it has an article on, various issues, but climate change wasn't a topical issue then. But certainly the CEDAW committee has now taken on climate change, and I think there's a general recommendation as well that looks at that. So we, the CEDAW committee is definitely now interested on how environmental disasters increase inequality in our society, and how in particular women are discriminated against in the responses to the climate change environment and the climate change issue. So it is a very much on the agenda, and it is one of those growing issues that more and more information is coming to the fore. In terms of International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, whose board I chair, that has now become a key issue. The whole issue around climate justice, the care economy, all of these things are now topical within the global community in which we work. So I think that, what I'm seeing is that there's just this groundswell of responses. This is why the UN has also taken it up, and the Commission on the Status of Women, because we see it as the most important and critical threat to the gender equality agenda. If you look at the UN Equality Forum, that also has got climate justice as a very important component to it. In one of the action coalitions looks at that. So I think that I'm talking about it on a global perspective now. It is a critical issue. It is impacting on us in different ways. In some countries, some areas like in the Pacific, the islands are absolutely being, washed away, and people are losing homes, livelihoods, and everything else. And there's a big call for us to address this, in a very serious way. We're seeing it across Africa, the droughts, the typhoons, and all of these things. And in some areas, it's a crisis within a crisis. So you have in Mozambique the insurgents that are coming in the face of the typhoons, and in the face of COVID. So all of these, the big issue for CEDAW is, how does it impact on existing inequality? How does it exacerbate existing inequality? And what are the mechanisms we need to put in place to stop that from widening the gap and deepening the inequality in our society? I'm really working and very committed to addressing this issue, but it's a very challenging problem that we face. Very challenging across all of our continents, whether it's the North or the South, the problems are there. They're different, but they're there. And they're there specifically for women in very different ways.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Foster. And we still have 2 minutes, and then I would like to ask Michelle. You have served in one of the largest women's organization, and you led lots of the you offered and you trained lots of the women and the young women. And could you give us the comments about the effective disaster risk reduction requires meaningful and diverse participation? I think you agree with that. For the diverse participation, engagement, and the leadership, particularly from the women, young women, and the girls, through an inclusive and acceptable all of society approach. Could you give us the comment on it? And then we will close this session. Michelle, please.
Yeah, look, I think that, I think that everything we've been talking about how important that women's leadership is in all of this, because ultimately we can't change this situation until we do see some shifting of power. And the way that, the whole system is set up is to exclude affected communities. It's based on a lot of jargon. It's based on, so many experts. And I think we really need to find ways that we lift the expertise of the communities that are most affected. And I think, as we were also talking about, from, you know, Indigenous communities that have sustained the environment for centuries, millennia, and you know, right now we're not doing that well. So I think leadership is key. And I think particularly, you know, from the experience, both in terms of our work at ActionAid, working with YWCA in the Pacific region, young women's leadership is a critical part of that. You know, we haven't talked so much about it, but it's important, you know, as you know, in terms of building feminist movements as well, that we continue to invest in that next generation and support, you know, young women to lead on these issues. And yeah, look, I mean, I think it's a big area, but I think that has to be our starting point, you know, shifting power and making sure women have greater access to resources. And within that we are looking at that being about women from the most affected communities.
Yes, thank you so much. I think in the future, the researchers should also focus, researchers or practical workers should also focus on that topic to provide policymakers with the reference on these issues. And for the first line risks of natural disaster, gender sensitivity analysis by different genders, it's a really important part for how to improve the environment disaster disadvantaged for women. And I thank you so much for all the participants and the panelists, your support and your participation. And I think we should have next time we should have more time to discuss about this issue continuously. So now, because the time is up, so we must close this session right now. And before we close this session, may we have a group photo together? So please open your camera, then we can ask our worker to make to help us have the photo.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Yapit, are you there? Yapit, please join us.
Yes,
Yapit,
I
you are there.
hear.
Good. Okay. Let's smile, please. Or wave your hands. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Please share the
you,
photo.
everyone.
Bye.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Thank you for your support.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Let's keep in touch.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
拜拜，老师拜拜。
不客气，谢谢你们，谢谢。